All right, let's talk some D.C. politics. And before we get to the headlines, because as usual, dysfunction in D.C., we got a question. Given the internal tug of war in the GOP lately, how would a Republican candidate fare if they took certain positions right now? Let's take immigration. And my friend Obi, I want you to take a listen to this and tell me how a candidate would do if they went ahead with the following positions. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though sometime back they may have entered illegally. Talking about both, obviously, the DREAM Act kids and also, obviously, the adults even who came in this country. And when talking about debt limit, obviously an issue we're dealing with now, and the brinksmanship going around it, what about this position? The full consequences of a default or even a serious prospect of a default by the U.S. are impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. Denigration of the full faith and credit of the U.S. would have substantial effects in the domestic financial markets and on the value of the dollar in exchange markets. The nation can ill afford to allow such a result. And then finally, another issue that we've talked about, and I believe when they come back from their nice month-long break, they're going to get back into, and that is guns and specifically on assault weapons, this position. I don't believe in taking away the right for a citizen for sporting, for hunting, and so forth, or for home defense. But I do believe that an AK-47, a machine gun, is not a sporting weapon or needed for defense of home. Okay, so if you took those positions today in 2013, could you get through a primary?
On a presidential race nationally?
Or even in U.S. Senate race?
Well,
let's say in a non-blue
it's all a question. As I say, it depends where you are.
Say middle of the road. I'm not talking a far red one. I'm talking a middle.
I always say you can't beat somebody with nobody, so it depends who you're up against and where they stand on this. The challenge is when you go through all of those, Republicans, the voters might forgive you on something and give you leeway, but when you start going too far to the center or they view the left, then you run out of base.
So national platform, no chance, no way for those three.
I don't see that on a national. If somebody has all of those put together, no, that gets to be very tough. I think, you again, it's a question of being local and what happens. If you're talking about the Northeast, talking about New York, talking about different things.
Presidential run.
It's primary-wise, it's tough. I mean,
no chance. Okay, and I think you're probably right. But to you good folks at home, I want to tell you who the author of all those were and so much more. None other than the beloved patron saint of the grand old party, the 40th president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, whose mere mention of his name and the gauzy highlight reel that they play at the conventions literally brought people to tears. Andrew can tell you from a first-hand account covering it in Tampa at this convention.
I know you were.
Okay, but
you had something in
the
your eyes,
idea that Ronald Reagan authored all those, and trust me, Andrew puts them together, you can cover the gamut on this, okay? Restricting ammo on guns here, talking about Social Security, they can't even touch the
raising
thing.
Gas taxes to spark infrastructure and spending stimulus.
Sure.
Think about where, Obi, we've come from 1980 to today.
But also, when you talk about gas tax for a second. When you talk about the gas prices being where they are and the burden on the American people, you start raising taxes, it's a different story than it was years ago. That's part of it. The second thing is...
We can have a debate, but you're intellectually honest on these things. Ronald Reagan.
No, I understand.
What did he say about guns? What did he say about immigration? What did he say about...
And here's one of the challenges on the immigration. As a great leader as he was, the challenge on immigration right now is what we did back then, when we went to fix it back then when he was president. Because it's happened again this many years later, the question becomes, how do we not let it happen? So we have to do this again and again and again. That's the challenge.
His spinning is getting me dizzy.
No, but I mean, think, Richard, we learn from what was done once before. Doesn't mean it has to happen again.
Can I translate what you're really trying to say?
Like tax cuts.
The crazies here are killing me, Rich. Ronald Reagan, God bless his soul, was right. We got to at least stop telling the right. And he even has a line in here where he says, the right hand doesn't always know what the far right hand is doing. You're not going to say it because I don't want to get into trouble. But these guys are killing you.
He also has the 11th commandment, too.
Yes, exactly.
Which is something that goes in there, too.
And remind everybody what that is for Republicans.
Not speak ill of another Republican.
Okay, but look what happens. God forbid a Republican says anything that doesn't follow the Tea Party line, they're primaried and they're threatened.
Again, it depends.
And they got to apologize to Rush on the next morning show.
You mentioned the Senate, though. The Senate then becomes a state issue. California and New York are very different than Arkansas, Louisiana. and we're going to see what's going on there now in those races.
We could
so
sit
it's
down.
red states,
I could get a
blue states.
Republican Senate here in one election cycle. You and I could figure out how to do it. But the cuckoo birds won't let you do it in the right here. On immigration, we both know they're crazy and they're killing you. On the gun stuff, it's not going to help you where they're going on this. On defaulting, come on now.
Any of these things by themselves aren't the issue. It's when you start combining everything together and you go a certain way with it. Nobody wants us to default. What we want to do is try to figure out how do we get spending under control.
I'm not so sure that's true, Obi. There are some people in your party who do want to default.
Yes.
Okay.
They do. They want to drown the government in the bathtub, and you and I both know it. Okay, and if that means taking us over the cliff, they've already done it once. They're happy to do it a second time.
They weren't around back. You're talking about when the government was shut down. You're going back to that point when they've done it once.
What about when we went past the debt limit and we saw our credit rating downgraded?
Those weren't good times.
That was also, at this point, luckily a blip in the screen because we got through that and we fixed it, right? We then raised it. It's back up again. The question becomes every time this issue comes up now, we revisit it every year or so.
Okay.
What can we do to cut spending?
Dominic, you
because
say
we have
this
a
all the
spending
time.
problem.
If a Republican said what the president said yesterday, which was basically, I'll give corporate tax rates, I'll cut them down, we'll do infrastructure. By the way, what Ronald Reagan said, okay? Do you think the reaction would have been the same as if is it the message or the messenger? Sometimes I think it's just because the president says something. They all complain they want him to stay out of it, right? I mean, they all complain that he doesn't talk to them. But when he talks to them, he's like, you're screwing up the process, get out of the picture. He can't win on this one. Obama ain't perfect, but in this one, I don't see how he wins when they don't want to hear from him, but if they didn't talk to him, then he's being high and mighty.
The president can't win on any of this, Richard. I mean, partisan politics, it's killing the country. And my good friend O.B., you know.
But there's a but for.
He's doing a great job of explaining you can't explain this stuff. It's, what did you say, nutty and cuckoo birds?
Oh, yeah, I could have
cuckoo
done better.
birds.
But wait, do you want him
That's
to shut
what
up
it
and
is.
stay out of immigration, or do you want him to get involved and have meetings with
No,
Republicans?
we want a solution to immigration reform. There's no question about it. How do we do it to make sure we don't face this problem
President let Marco Rubio basically do it and be the
years?
poster child for it. And now look what happens.
He's walking away from his own plan.
Right.
You know, you never know what happens. You never know what happens in those behind those closed rooms, the closed doors. The reality is, we have to have something in place. We don't revisit this every 20 years.
Those tap shoes coming to 13.
He's pretty good.
And you got the Bucks on too tonight, right?
Yes. All right. We're going to leave the silliness of politics for a minute and get to honestly a story that everybody, I think, ought to be rooting for here. And I think it says a lot about where we are right now on an issue that has changed so much. We're going to sit down with a local high school basketball coach, not because it's a sports show, but because of his personal story. He came out of the closet, and his team's reaction, certainly something not just he's proud of, but I think we all ought to be. He's going to join us next. Stay with us.